Welcome to George Talks Business. My name is Mark Hyman. I am a professor of sport management at GW. I'm joined by Bailey Weiss, a senior in the School of Business and president of the Student-Led Sports Business Association. And we're very pleased today to be joined by two people who have jobs that we all dream of having someday. They cover baseball for the Washington Post. Barry Sverluga, who is a columnist at the Post, and Sam Fortier, who is a sports reporter, also covering baseball all through this World Series run. So we'd like to begin. We're going to get to the World Series, which is, I think, why many of us are here. But let's begin by talking about the career path for a sports journalist. If you want to be an investment banker, you apply to a great business school, preferably this one. If you want to be a CPA, similar path. What is the path for someone who aspires to be a baseball writer?
So I think we probably have completely different experiences with this. I think my path is irrelevant now. It doesn't exist anymore. The Post is my fourth newspaper. I started at a small paper in upstate New York that was 16,000 circulation, went to a slightly less small paper, then to Raleigh News and Observer, and then came to the Post 16 years ago. So I think to someone like Sam, that seems fairly foreign. My first year covering baseball, I was 32. That is now considered an old baseball writer. So, so you can speak to your path.
Yeah, I think the path, I went to journalism school at Syracuse and worked at the student paper there, and then interned at the Post in summer 2018. Had the opportunity to work at The Athletic, which is a startup, or was a startup, but is now obviously a pretty big company, and then came back here in April. But I think the path, you don't have to have a specific major or a specific, you don't have to go to journalism school. I think a lot of reporters that I know just worked at the college paper. I think just doing it is probably the best way to make a path and find a passion for that.
And that's what I worked at my college paper and didn't go to a journalism school. So
Great. Well, let's get started and talk about events at Nats Park over the last 6 weeks. Bailey, I think you have a question for the group.
Yeah, so my first question for you guys is the 2019 Nationals had the highest average player age out of any other team in the MLB. How do veterans such as Ryan Zimmerman and Howie Kendrick impact a team in order, to get over the hump? I know the Nationals have not seen, much success in terms of playoffs. So what impact do they have in order to, kind of get them where they were?
So it's kind of I guess I'll start by saying it's kind of an interesting way that happened, because it's actually at a time when older players are being phased out. And if you want to think of it from a business perspective, teams are valuing younger players that's younger is code for cheaper, much more than a guy who's, in Ryan Zimmerman's case, 35, and Howie Kendrick's case, 36, because they feel like they can get similar production out of and not pay someone, in Zimmerman's case, $18 million this year. But I think from the experience in the clubhouse would be that experience mattered, and having been there before and failed in most cases mattered, and that kind of formed the personality of the club, I would think, to a certain degree. Would you agree?
Right. When you walk in that clubhouse every day and, they get to that 19 and 31 point that's become pretty famous now. I mean, veterans like Ryan Zimmerman or Howie Kendrick would say, it's fine. It's just May. And at that, at that time, you're thinking, okay, it's not just May. This is a pretty big deal. But I think the steadying presence of veterans who are, maybe considered inefficiencies by the market, as Barry pointed out, ended up being pretty important for the Nationals. And I think they really embraced that. They called themselves the Viejos toward the end, and I think having those guys, especially with the blend of youth that they had in Juan Soto and Victor Robles, I think that dynamic and just how much fun they had together, and how they got Ryan Zimmerman to use the walker as his dugout dance, I think that blend was really important, not just the veterans, but also the youth and kind of how they work together.
Which player would you say, based on performance, which player do you think on the Nats this year increased their market value going into 2020 most?
Well, I mean, you have to understand baseball's salary structure because it doesn't really. Juan Soto is the answer because he made a little over $500,000 because that's what you get paid when you're in your first couple of years. There's no just instant marketability. You don't get your market rate until you have 6 years of service time in. So baseball's salary structure is in your first 3 years in the league, the club can essentially assign you whatever salary it wants. The major league minimum now is like 550-ish. Yeah. And it grows up each year, collectively bargained, but that's the minimum. If you have between 0 and 1 years of service, you're going to make about the minimum. It'll go up a little bit, but that's at the club's discretion. Years 3 through 6, it's essentially a real estate problem. Your salary is determined by arbitration. You look at comparable players' age, performance, years of service. That determines your salary. And then finally, as Anthony Rendon is about to find out, when you get 6+ years in, then your market value is determined by the market.
Yeah, and let's talk about that group, because those guys could benefit tremendously. Steven Strasburg, of course, in that group as well.
For sure.
Yeah, I think the 3 players that really added the most immediate value would be Howie Kendrick, Steven Strasburg, and Anthony Rendon. Anthony Rendon obviously hitting free agency for the first time. That's a pretty big deal. And just his clutch play in the postseason. I know some people don't believe in clutch, but what he was able to do in the 7th inning or later of elimination games was pretty impactful. And I think Steven Strasburg, coming into this season, you think that deal looks like an albatross for the Nationals, and he ends up opting out of 4 years and $100 million. So I think he'll be able to get a deal much more lucrative than that. And I think Howie Kendrick, he was coming off a ruptured Achilles last season, and now I think he's one of the leading candidates for a DH in an American League, or even if he wants to stay in the National League. I think he earned himself quite a bit of money just with his season and the way he was able to balance not playing every day but also still remaining an effective hitter.
Sam, you said some people don't believe in clutch. Crazy idea, this notion of being able to perform under pressure. What do you mean by that?
I think baseball, maybe more than any other sport right now, it utilizes its spreadsheets, and they think this is probability, and this is if we trade for this player, we are going to increase our chances of winning by 1% or 0.5%. And I think everybody thinks about how you win on the margin, especially in a game like baseball where you have 162 games. You will find level. I think at some point, and so you might see Anthony Rendon, when he in the 7th inning or later of their 5 elimination games this season, at one point he had walk, home run, double, home run, double, home run, double, and I think a lot of people would dismiss that as a statistical aberration.
Right. I mean, what Sam's exactly right, and what as baseball front offices try to quantify more things. And baseball it led analytics. Analytics are being used across all sports now, but baseball was at the forefront because statistics have kind of always been at the heart of how we look at the sport, how we evaluate the sport, how we enjoy the sport. Front offices have taken it beyond that and really tried to control for things that might be random. We've thought that David Ortiz was a clutch player. Well, was he? What do the numbers really show? Is that random? I think going back to the original point about the age of the Nationals, there are members of the Nationals front office that would say, no, we've proven that numbers are very important. The human element is just as important. It's an ongoing discussion in baseball as, the general managers are not typically Mike Rizzo, former minor league ball player, lifelong scout. They are Theo Epstein, Yale graduate, or even beyond that, Harvard Business School grad. Somebody from George Washington Business School might someday be a GM. Those are the kind of candidates that they're looking at now.
So you talked a little bit about how we enjoy the game, with the Capitals winning the championship in 2018, with the Mystics just a few weeks ago, and the Nats. Do you think that finally dispels any criticisms that DC has gotten in terms of being a sports town?
So I'll just start with that because I've had this discussion. I was at Caps practice yesterday, and just talking, everybody was kind of interested in the Nats run and how did it compare and what were the differences. it's inarguable that Washington, D.C. as a sports town is in a much different place than it was 18 months ago. There were, I don't know how many people would have been at those Capitals games, 7s against the Penguins, or at Nats Park for a game 5. And it's just undeniable that the feeling prior to all this was when something went wrong, the expectation was that something else would go wrong. And the place kind of just folded in on itself, and it just got tense. My thought during that time, for the Capitals at least, was it would be so much easier for them to play these biggest games on the road because they're quieting a road crowd carried more power than kind of firing your own group up. So that flipped at some point. The Caps thing, I think, mattered. That kind of informed how the Nats crowd felt about what was going to happen. I'm just supposing this, but I know that the feeling in the building was different. If you go to a wild card game, they're down 3-1 against the Brewers. Josh Hader, very good pitcher on the mound. I didn't feel dread in the building. I felt like there was hope, and then once Juan Soto gets that hit and it flips everything, that kind of, to me, it filled the rest of the games of the postseason with hope in the ballpark, even when they were losing all those World Series games. They never led a World Series game at home. The fan base felt like it was mentally in a much different place.
If you look at, they came back from deficits in each of their 5 elimination games. So in the World Series Game 7, I'm sitting in the press box with our colleague Chelsea Janes, and it was like, the Nationals are down in the 7th inning, pencil in a curly W. That's really what it felt like.
Right.
And I mean, Barry can speak to the city element and how the city feels much better than I can. He's been here for 16 years, but I will point out that the day I moved here for my internship last summer, the Capitals won the Stanley Cup, and I started on the Nationals beat this season. So right. I'm not saying there's causation. I'm just saying.
Yeah. So Bailey and I have prepared a list of unanswerable questions for you, starting with this one, which I think is the most unanswerable, which is, famously, Bryce Harper elected to sign with the Phillies for $330 million because $300 million from the Nats just didn't seem to measure up. If Bryce Harper had been a Nat this year, what would have been different?
Okay, it's unanswerable. So I do think it's important to note, just as I stall trying to find an answer, that $300 million from the Nats and $330 million from the Phillies were never on the table at the same time. He did not choose one over the other because they didn't exist concurrently. That's not to say he's not a Philadelphia Philly, which he is. I think we looked at this a little bit in the postseason. I have always been of the mind that people who say, like, well, you can't win with Bryce Harper, you can't win with 30 homers and 100 RBIs, I don't understand that. It doesn't make sense to me. Baseball is not a chemistry sport in the same way that basketball or hockey are, and that there's a ball to be shared or a puck to be shared, and all that is, it's a very individual team sport. That said, one of the ways that the Nationals won was, again, going against the grain in the style of the Major League game now, which is a lot of strikeouts and a lot of home runs. This team put the ball in play a lot. Kendrick is a great example of that. Sometimes it goes out of the yard, but it doesn't have to. Rendon's a great example. Adam Eaton's a great example. There wasn't a high strikeout club. Bryce adds a high strikeout element at a key spot in the order. So while I'm not arguing that they're a better team without one of the better players in the league, I do think there's a stylistic element that where he would have been a little bit out of sync with this lineup.
And you can also look at roster construction as well. I think if you get Bryce Harper, that doesn't preclude you from getting Patrick Corbin, signing him for $140 million. But it becomes, I think, a lot bigger ask, especially when management had emphasized that they're trying to stay below the luxury tax. So, and obviously we see in the postseason how Patrick Corbin is valuable, not just in the fact that he gives them 3 big starters, but also his versatility to come out of the bullpen. If you're missing an arm of his caliber, and I mean, Mike Rizzo, the general manager, made 6 bets on his bullpen this season, 3 before the season, 3 at the trade deadline, and really only one of them panned out. So Patrick Corbin was really able to, kind of cover that for him. So if you have Bryce Harper, I'm not sure if you get Patrick Corbin, and I think that's a really key element of the Bryce discussion.
So prior to Game 5 of the World Series, manager Davie Martinez came in and said that Max Scherzer wasn't going to be starting. As sports writers, how does your approach change, especially when breaking news like that is shared with you guys?
Yeah, you freak out. Because rarely you kind of have to understand exactly how surprising that was. That was not on anybody's radar. And I've reconstructed it in my mind because Max had been talking to us the day before, and I had asked him a question about his back. And he kind of really wanted to make it specific about the back, and he didn't mention his neck. Now, his neck hadn't locked up like it eventually did yet. So how did that work, Sam? You went up to the press box to write?
Yeah, it was complete panic because sometimes you hear things, this might happen, and you get an inkling, okay, this could happen, but we had no idea.
You were not prepared.
No, and so I ran up to the press box. Adam Kilgore, our colleague, had kind of written like a very quick 200-word thing we put up, just kind of saying this is the news, and then we fleshed it out with context from the rest of the season. This must be really bad because obviously he broke his nose earlier in the season and still pitched anyway. So this is a guy where he can't pitch because of what he's done in the past, what he's pitched through.
And then you're trying to supplement the reporting, right? So where's Mike Rizzo? Like what's the timeline? You're thinking not just the news, but what is the story? What information can we provide? What are the details? Where was he? How did he come in? Who did he talk to? All that kind of stuff.
So I have a question as much about you guys as about the World Series. So we know how fans felt in the aftermath of Game 7 because the city was delirious. You're sitting in the press box the moment the Nats win the World Championship. What emotion are you feeling?
I think not panic. I think for me, I'm not a Nationals fan. I'm not rooting for the Nationals, but the magnitude of the moment was, I think, really special. It was really cool to understand that, I think back to our colleague Tom Boswell, who's been at this paper for 50 years and written about baseball, and just, for him to see, the hometown team win a championship, I thought it was a really special moment. I don't know if I was, really happy or anything. It was just a really cool moment to be a part of, and then you immediately put your head down and keep typing.
Yeah, there's a logistical element too. So so I'm trying to make as many papers as possible. The logistics of that are, I've filed the first version of my column in the 9th inning. So I'm actually looking at it and able to see how it plays out, where your head has been kind of in your laptop for a long time, and you're also getting rid of all the stuff that said, "Oh, they lost 3-1."
Explain that.
Greinke.
Explain that.
Well, it's a very real part of the job, and in fact, there's probably some of the best sports writing that is ever available is dead in sports writers' laptops because the outcome they were writing about didn't occur. So that happened during the Caps run to me. That happened during the Nats run for certain. I mean, you go back to the wild card game. I have 800 words on they failed again.
So you're writing during the game.
There's no other option
yeah.
because their deadline. My deadline is by the end of the game, and they would appreciate it if it's an 8-1 game, or in this case, in Game 7, it ended up being 6-2. At that point, you're rooting for those runs to be tacked on because 3-2, you're really with that bullpen, you're very nervous that it could flip again. 6-2, you're breathing more easily, you're writing more confidently. You don't think you're going to have to flip it back. So there's the logistics then become. You file, and then an hour after the game, you come back again, and you've talked to people, you've been down on the field. Sam, there's a picture, Tyler Kepner from the New York Times took a photo of Sam and I actually sitting in the dugout typing because it was the most convenient place. All the people are on the field. It saves you, 6 minutes, 8 minutes to go back up to the press box. Those are very, very meaningful minutes. My job was different than Sam's because he was not writing for the paper, was only writing for the website, so that frees you up. But I felt an enormous amount of obligation and pressure to have the best version. That some people are going to hang this thing on the wall, not because you were there, but because of what happened. You want it to be the best of what you've got in a very, very short amount of time.
So what were you feeling, Barry?
Well, for me, it's a little different because I was the first beat writer at the Post when baseball came back in 2005, and had that experience covering the return and baseball not being there for 33 years. I always say, like, you root for two things. You root for yourself. So logistically, how does this help? What's the best story? This story this fall had to change. If they had lost again in Game 5 of the division series, I would have been at risk of plagiarizing myself from previous years, because it's the same brain thinking the same thoughts about the same result, and it just gets old. It was the same thing with the Capitals. If they had lost to Pittsburgh again, it's just like, oh my gosh, I've used all these phrases. I'm a thesaurus of my own work, and that's no fun. It was much. I can't deny. Well, I'm not rooting for the Nationals. I have no stake in their winning. It was a much more fun October that they flipped the script. How they did it mattered because all the stories were very dramatic. I really think it made for a nice theme for what this team was about. And it just makes for good writing, which is what I cared about. I felt some ownership of the story because I've been there long enough to have been there at the beginning. And it was a pleasure to see it through.
So I guess I have a hard-hitting question for you guys. Baby Shark swept the team and swept the season. What were your immediate reactions to it, and did you guys hop on the craze?
I mean, in mid-June, I think it was a day game. Gerardo Parra walked up to the plate as a pinch hitter, and I heard Baby Shark, and I had no idea what it was. And I remember I tweeted something about it, and a couple parents that follow me that I'm friends with were like, "It's good that you don't know that, because that's all we hear at our house." But I was just very confused. And then we get down in the clubhouse, and you ask him about it, and he just said, "Oh yeah, that's my daughter really loved that song. I'm kind of in a funk at the plate right now. I'm going to try something different." So I mean, I think that Gerardo Parra generally, and Baby Shark specifically, sort of embodies what this team was about and sort of their vibe all year. And I think what made the blend of the youth and the older players really mesh. And I think that sort of became a litmus test for what happened later.
Yeah, I mean, there's something there, and that it's not tangible. If you go back to how we were talking about analyzing the numbers, there's no Baby Shark factor that analytics head will be able to point to and say, there you have it. That's why they did it. There's that great, I don't know if you remember, so they did the little shark thing over to the dugout, depending on which hit it was, and Freddie Freeman, the Braves first baseman, I think it was Kendrick, actually hit a single, and they did the thing over the dugout, and Freeman was like, "What?"
Yeah.
So it took explaining to everybody at some point.
In the business school, we're mildly interested in numbers and dollars. So the Nats just played 4 weeks longer than most Major League Baseball teams, sold out every game at Nats Park. Where does the money come from, and where does it go? I mean, mostly, where does it go?
Okay, the easy answer on the comes from is mostly television, and that should be just applied over all sports everywhere. But it does matter that more games is more revenue. It's more people in the seats. It's more concessions sold. So in a way, if they wanted to max out their postseason revenue, then sweeping the Cardinals in the NLCS was the wrong answer, because it denied them one gate receipt in that fifth game. There is a revenue sharing throughout baseball. The more games in the postseason is a bigger slice of the pie for everybody, so that doesn't impact the Nationals specifically. But merchandising opportunities are obviously much more. They're going to make money off of every one of those World Series champion things that you buy. I'm in the process of trying to quantify how much it means. I've heard different estimates from $40 million to $100 million. It's a net plus that is significant, and I'm hopeful to have an answer before spring training starts.
So that's the ownership perspective.
Correct.
What about the players? What do the players earn?
You want to do that, or you want?
I think a full share is about 300.
Yeah. So they take all the revenue or all the profit from the postseason, and in the CBA it gives the players a certain percentage, and so the losing team in a wild card game gets X. You get more if you advance to the division series. You get more if you advance to the LCS, and the World Series champion has the largest piece of the pie. It's up to the players to then say, okay, this is how much money we have. Who are we voting a full share to? So obviously, Max Scherzer, Steven Strasburg, Anthony Rendon are going to get whatever a full share comes out to be. But then you factor in not only Matt Grace, who was a relief pitcher who was jettisoned midstream, or Trevor Rosenthal, who was a historically bad signing at the beginning of the season. He did play for the team. Players respect players. He will get some cut of their postseason winnings because he appeared for this team during their championship season. And then you get down to clubhouse staff, traveling secretary, media people who are in the clubhouse will get some of them will be voted full shares. So depending how generous a specific clubhouse is, the clubbies can get life-changing money, $350,000 or something.
So it's something that we kind of saw when UMBC made their run that impacted their admissions records. In terms of the Nationals making it through the postseason to the World Series, what impact do you think that has on 2020 ticket sales, Nats Park naming rights?
Sort of the bump that mid-level schools get from deep tournament success runs in college. I think you see season tickets are sort of that bump that professional sports franchises get. So I would expect the Nationals will see something like that, not just in merchandising or single game gates or anything like that, but I think season tickets is probably where you'll see that most.
And that's an important part because they had been going in the wrong direction. They hosted the All-Star Game in 2018. You get a bump from that because they tie a lot of packages into, if you want to go to the All-Star Game, we'll buy a partial season ticket package. They had been trending, they had attendance that went down pretty significantly this summer. That will definitely change. And then there was one other thing that I can't remember. There's some
Naming rights.
Naming rights you mentioned. So that is actually a mystery to me. They have, in my mind, the stadium has been open since 2008. That is 12 seasons in which they have left money on the table because it has never been. They've always been waiting for the right deal, and the Lerners are more than anything very patient. So Ted Lerner was not going to just sell it to whoever. Just for a few extra dollars. I have no indication. They've been close. They've never done one. I don't know whether this changes it and all of a sudden it'll be Geico Park next year.
Okay, so back to you guys. Do owners and players read what you write? And if they do, what do you hear?
You can frame things to them. Okay, do I have the right read on the situation? It seems like built by you being around, you observing, you talking to people, and they can tell you, whether they think you're right or wrong, and you can kind of, go forward with that. But in terms of, I wrote a story, you are telling me what you think of it. I don't hear that much about it. I think the thing that catches most people's attention is something that blows up that maybe, and he, maybe he phrased some things that were, some people felt that he the minors, and that got a lot of attention, and obviously he reacted to that. But on a day-to-day basis, I'm writing a story for tomorrow. I didn't hear that much feedback, to be honest.
So I probably have a little bit somebody, and so the conversation then is, have you read it? If you haven't read it, come back to me when you have. I will say that the front office and ownership are careful readers of the coverage, and it's their brand that you're writing about, and they are aware that you're analyzing their decisions, sometimes kind of harshly. I have picked up. If Mike Rizzo was sitting here, we could tell you 12 years of screaming fights we've had over the phone or in person about different things. So you have to have a relationship with the people that you cover. It's fraught just by nature, but in order to build a respect, they know you, you know them, they know how you handle things. A big thing about baseball is if you are critical, it's great because there's always a forum to show up the next day, and you kind of can air things out then. But I would say that players less so, but front office and ownership, they know what you're writing.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about the kind of rhythm of covering baseball. You cover the National Football League, you're basically covering 8 games in a year. Unless your team goes, there are a
16.
couple of, 8 home games, right?
Yeah, but you're traveling.
Yeah. 16 games in a season, 2 exhibition games, and the rest of the year, you're not writing about what's happening on the field. Baseball, I shudder to think how many baseball games you saw this year. Probably close to 190, 200?
Well, neither of us did.
Yeah.
Jesse Doherty, our main beat writer, saw the most. I've done that drill. I have covered 150, maybe 145, 150 regular season games, and then you tack on 6-7 weeks of spring training when you're in Florida that whole time, hoping to come home for 3 or 4 days at some point. So it's a factor. I covered the Redskins for 4 years. That's when we had a child, because it's a day job and you're only gone a little bit. It's hard to have a family and cover baseball in a capacity where you have to be there every day. Like Boz and myself we kind of work it out. We're there a couple times a piece during a homestand. We were there every playoff game, but that's just 1 month. You can manage one month. It's a little different for the beat writers.
Right. And Jesse certainly took on the lion's share of that. But it was sort of the rhythm of baseball was new to me because this was my first season covering it. And last fall, I covered the Los Angeles Chargers. So I did write about football. And in the NFL, every game is sort of do or die. And the entire season changes if you lose this game. And I remember our night desk, our night editor, I filed a couple first sort of like my writing because every game wasn't, the do or die that it is in the NFL. And I think the rhythm, it was sort of, someone said that you got to think about every game as a chapter in the book of a national season. So sometimes, and Jesse and I really concentrated on what made this game different, or, we tried to write about if their 5th starter, whoever that was, Eric Fetty, Joe Ross, Austin Voth, if they were starting, the game story was about what did they do to try to cement this thing that the Nationals are still trying to figure out. If Howie Kendrick had a great game, he had this great game, but you can't play him every day. Here's how they're trying to balance his workload. So you try to figure out that you can pull out from the season-long narrative. That's what you want to write that night.
So I want to invite the audience to be thinking about questions, because in a few minutes we're about to go to questions from the audience. I had one more for you, and it's as much a writing question as it is a Nats question. When you sit down at your laptop after the game, and you don't have a word yet on your screen, how do you deal, on deadline, how do you deal with that terror? What strategies?
So I have a couple things that I kind of lean on, and one, as we discussed, like there is no blank screen at the end of a game because I've had to hit the deadline before the game even ended. So hopefully you feel like your framework, you feel like the bones are there. The terrifying nights are when you're like, oh my God, I had to file that because that's what was on my screen when it was my deadline, but I've got to totally blow it up. It's been interesting for me for years to sit next to Tom Boswell because we go about it much differently. He is typing and typing and typing and typing and typing and typing, and sometimes ends up with 3,000, 3,500 words on his screen and then has to cut and cut and cut. I don't like to, in general, I try not to write anything until the 5th or 6th inning at the earliest, because I just find I'm chasing myself then. If the story changes, then why did I write that in the first place? I'm comfortable. I always tell young writers, you have to know yourself. I know that if I come back from the clubhouse and I have 25 minutes to redo the story that I've already filed, that's enough. I can go through my notebook. I can listen to tape if it's a longer quote. and I can feather in and change transitions and rework it that way. But it really is about, people have totally different styles. I think that muscle memory and reps matter, but some people are really gifted from the start and can do it from Jump Street.
I think definitely, during the season, when you were on deadline, it was just like, it has to exist, so it does. Necessity is the mother of invention. But I think like in the postseason, Barry and I had very different experiences because I was sitting down after a game, coming back from Clubhouse, and I had no words written. And I think a good example of that was after Game 7, our editor wanted me to go to wherever they were having their post-game celebration and write sort of the story about how they celebrated the win. So I was at the third floor bar of the Four Seasons until 3:30 in the morning, and you get back to the hotel at 4, and you've been up all day thinking like, okay, how am I going to do this different? How am I going to write something that adds value to our coverage that all these reporters don't have? And you sit down and at a blank screen. So for me, the thing that always gets me in the rhythm, sort of that muscle memory, getting something out. I listen to different music on like a Spotify playlist, or I'll get up and like just walk around the room. I do a lot of weird things, I guess, to try to get yourself into that frame of mind. And I think one of the easiest things is just having material to write. So I was the only reporter at the hotel where they were celebrating. So you just think, okay, what is something that I have that no one else has that I can use? And I just tried to write that scene at the top, and you try to write the scene at the bottom, and you try to have these things that really bring people there, because that's what I think people want to read, is the things that they didn't see, and it's just focusing on getting those things and trying to find those things. And if you sit down at a blank screen and you can fill it up with that sort of insight, then I think that's a good place to start.
We've gotten about halfway through my note cards, but I think it's time to go to the audience. Yes.
So I've been a loyal Washington Post sports reader for years. One of the most bizarre things about the World Series run was that now I had other options to choose from. It wasn't just the Post covering it every day. I'm actually a historian of DC, so it was interesting to see how national sports coverage and the narrative that they constructed was, in my opinion, very different than the one that especially you, Barry, and Tom constructed. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between how you see DC as a city and how that was differed in the national coverage?
So I'm curious, what was the difference? What did you see nationally?
Nationally, it was very, the divided Washington
Right,
comes
right,
together, and
right.
it was very, I thought, like the traditional Washington view, and I felt like the Post was very more DC-centric, right, that divide.
So, okay, so there's a couple things going on there probably. One, the Washington Post as an institution, and our sports department specifically is kind of, we're kind of battling, like we want to be and are a national paper and we cover national things, but we also have local obligations, and that includes, is the Silver Line not running or are the Nats winning, right? So I do think it's a very easy trope to fall into to say, well, the Nats have united this town. And I know Boz and I were careful about not just stating that. Washington is assumed to be a lot of things for people who don't live here. I don't find them to really ring true in day-to-day life. So I think just naturally we write what we know. And I'm not blaming anybody from outside for wanting to find that hook, or is the country divided? Sure. Like, could a baseball team be a uniting force? Maybe. I just think that since Tom being a native Washingtonian who's worked here his whole career, and me as somebody who has some roots now over time, it didn't even really occur to me to write that thing, because it wasn't what I felt was happening, if that makes any sense.
Thank you both for being here. Barry, you wrote a very in-depth story this summer about attendance being down at Nats Park. Did they give you a lot of grief for that story? And are they pushing to have a story written now that shows that the ballpark has been filled throughout the whole playoffs.
No, that's it's an interesting thing. I mean, in that case, numbers are numbers, right? I mean, the way attendance is represented in Major League Baseball is through ticket sales. So you can have a number that is 30,000 when it's a dreary night and only 12,000 people show up. Your number is going to be 30,000. So they were upfront about this is why we think it's happening. And they hung a lot of it on the All-Star game. We got a big bump from that. We were naturally going to lag down. And they were frank about, look, we were supposed to go to the World Series last year, and we went 82-80, and there are a lot of questions about the manager, and are they ever going to get over the hump? I don't think they were hid from much of it, at least in my experience. They made executives available to me. And I think we will chart it going forward. What should Washington be as a baseball town? Now that they've won the World Series, what do they have their greatest attendance? I mean, the largest attendance for the Nationals since baseball returned in 2005 is still 2005, the year that baseball came back for a lousy team, but there was the newness of it. The second largest is actually 2013 because you do get a bump. They won their first division title in 2012, and they got the bump the following year, a year that ended up being a disappointment. So you can kind of trace attendance to, as Sam was saying earlier, to the previous year. So we would expect that there'd be quite a bump.
Hi there. My name is Ethan Barr. I'm a student at GW Law here. So I am taking a class in sports law. So this is kind of all very relevant right now. I noticed recently, as a huge baseball fan, it kind of surprised me that this was the third least viewed World Series of all time. So just kind of as journalists, around fans in the ballparks, and you see during the World Series the fervor is greatly increased as compared to the regular season. Obviously, 162 games, not everyone's going to make it to the games. But just from your perspective, and just being around fans in the ballpark, what do you think that you would attribute to kind of this downswing in viewership? Possibly attendance, and if kind of alternatively, do you think that there is a possibility that baseball will turn a corner sooner or later?
So I have a couple thoughts on that. One is I think people want to look at World Series ratings or All-Star Game ratings or national ratings for baseball and say, oh, they're at this all-time low or they're among the lowest, and therefore the sport is sick. Baseball is healthy in a lot of ways. It's just differently healthy than the NFL is. The revenue for baseball is about $11 billion a year now, highest it's ever been. There are a lot of measurables. They are way ahead on their online engagement. Their app is the best of any sport. They get the highlight, the condensed game thing. But it is, frankly, a local sport now. If you had a World Series between the Yankees and the Dodgers, or last year the Red Sox and the Dodgers, or 2016, the Cubs were kind of a national entity, and that storyline played nationally. You can get, people interested, but Houston is about Houston, and DC is about DC, and neither of them have as interesting as I find Washington DC baseball history. I understand that nationally, somebody in Seattle is not going to be like, well, in 1933, they last appeared in the series. In 24, Walter Johnson came out of the bullpen. Like, no one cares about that nationally. That doesn't mean it's not healthy locally. And the largest revenue stream locally so the NFL has a massive national TV packages. The backbone of revenue for baseball teams is their local TV package, and we can get into the weeds on that one here. I'd rather not. But that's where you're getting a lot of. So you can have it be both ways. You can have low World Series ratings nationally and have the two markets that were in it be totally invested and rabid about it. Both of those things can be true.
I think the point Barry's making, we just need to recalibrate expectations. And I think once you look at it as a regional product, and that plays out in the revenue and TV deals, as Barry was saying, baseball's revenue has never been higher. We talk about attendance and we talk about TV deals, but if you look at it as a regional sport, I think it's healthy, it's doing well. I think maybe it's if you look at it through that prism, I think that baseball is doing well, and you can. There's obviously a lot of divide in the game about are home runs and strikeouts good for baseball? Is the style of baseball is that healthy? Is that how we want the game to be? And I think baseball itself probably wants more balls in play, because more balls in play means more highlights, which means just more engagement on the app and everything like that. But I think just if you look at the numbers, if you look at the revenues and sort of you adjust for expectations, I think the game's in a good spot.
We haven't spoken on this panel about baseball's aging demographic, which is of great concern to baseball. Baseball fans tend to be much older than NBA and NFL. So you see some effort being made by MLB to try to engage a younger audience. I think that's an area where you're going to see Major League Baseball trying to affect some measurable changes.
Well, for sure, but I also think that baseball understands that engagement doesn't have to be necessarily I'm sitting down 150 times and watching a 3-hour program. Engagement can be a 10-year-old kid who went to bed before the end of the game, waking up and checking his tablet and watching the highlights and knowing that Anthony Rendon homered twice and carrying that information, talking about it. It is a long product that goes a lot of the time. It's a huge time investment. But if you go back to attendance, I always am careful if you're looking at Nationals attendance. If there are 18,500 people at Nationals Park, we say, well, where is everybody? That is a small crowd. The Capitals, I have lauded for years for selling out their place at about 18,500 for 41 home dates. That's a remarkable run of success. You're asking baseball to draw 10,000 more or 12,000 more than that twice as many times to be deemed a success. So there's a lot of apples and oranges things going on here, but I always want to look through at baseball attendance through that prism of like, well, why is one so just roundly called bonanzas and the other one is criticized as a sparse crowd?
And I do think baseball definitely wants to bring the time of play down. And I think they're doing a lot of different things. Even the minor leagues, you want more balls in play, so you experiment with moving the mound back. You incentivize, different styles of play. And I think even the minor leagues, they are now using like a runner on second in extra innings to try to, end games faster. And so you don't get stuck in 13, 14 innings. And I think that sort of asks a question to a lot of baseball fans who baseball is so rooted in traditionalism. What is the way forward if you want games to end quicker and you want the sport to grow and you want the aging demographic to come down, the average viewer demographic to come down? I mean, what do you do? And I think there's a lot of things in baseball that kind of go without question, like why is a mound 60 feet 6 inches from home plate? I don't think, we don't know that. It's not in the middle of the diamond. People think it's
right
between first and third and home. They think it's the center, but it's not. And I think there's a lot of questions like that in the game. And, maybe you try something different. I think it's similar to maybe how a shootout is in hockey where you start a runner on second. But that's just something. They're experimenting with those things that question kind of the traditional aspects of the game. And I think that's probably healthy.
Hi, my name is Guthrie. I'm a senior in the business school. I'm also part of the Sports Business Association here. And one thing that I couldn't help but notice was that, so it was game 6 where Davie Martinez had his very famous tirade on the field after that call was, after that call stood. But I also remembered back to May when, I don't know what our record was at this point, but it was against the Mets. I think it was at Citi Field, and Davey had a tirade just like that one, where he got tossed out of the game, and then this really good run ensues. How much do you think moments like that, moments of frustration, played a role in what wound up happening?
I think those two sort of blow-ups were different. The one in New York when they hit 19 and 31, that was on whether or not an umpire should have appealed a check swing for Howie Kendrick. And I don't think that was, necessarily. I think that was a byproduct of frustration of him just wanting to do something, because that, our beat writer Jesse was there, and I remember talking to him after, and that didn't feel like an inspiring sort of moment. That felt sort of sad. But the one where he defends Trey Turner in Game 6 of the World Series, I mean, Trey Turner really felt like his manager was behind him, and obviously I think he. Davie, several times throughout the year, and I think as all good baseball managers do, you want your players to understand that you're behind them and that you're going to stick up for them when they feel that they've been wronged. So in Game 6 of the World Series, when he does that for Trey Turner, I think that fires up, the entire team because, you just understand that this guy who's, in May his job was on the line. I think that was a different situation. But in Game 6, he comes through and shows, even on a national stage, even when the risks are high that I get thrown out or something else might happen, I'm going to be behind you. I think that was really important.
I'm Dave Koenig, law school alumnus of GW. Before I get to my question, just for the record, before we get too carried away about attendance, we should remember Game 4 of the Dodgers series. There were about 7,000 empty
That's right.
seats, and that was the evening after the 7-run, I forget if it was 5th or 6th inning, with Patrick Corbin, and the Nats went down 2-1. But anyway, you both stated very eloquently your emotions after Game 7. There's an old saying, there's no rooting in the press box. Did you see any rooting in the press box, either now or during the course of your careers? And how do you compare and contrast your role versus the broadcast journalists who clearly are rooting for the Nationals?
So I would just say it seems people tend not to believe me when I say there really is no cheering in the press box. These are incredibly professional environments. We got into sports writing presumably for some sort of love of sports and or writing in some sort of sliding scale depending on the person. But you can't. I can be happy for a person. I could be happy for Ryan Zimmerman, who I was there the day he was drafted. That is different than hoping Ryan Zimmerman, is the World Series MVP. There's it's amazing how quiet working press boxes are because they are working press boxes. I have seen situations in college sports where websites that cover a specific school and are a little more fan leading. People wear the colors, et cetera, stuff like that. That gets a little out of hand, but I can tell you that I am conscious of stupid things like, well, it's the 7th game of the World Series. I can't wear a red sweater because then it looks like I'm rooting for the Nats. Like I'm going to wear green because neither of these teams wear green. I mean, it comes down to that. Like you really are not only living a neutral life, but presenting as a neutral life. Root for the story, root for yourself, and if that's what happened and you end up covering a parade, that's great.
And I agree with that as well, just the clothing down to that. But I think the broadcast element, those broadcasters oftentimes are paid by the team. So that's just sort of, the nature of their job is, if the team does well, they go forward and that's sort of who writes their checks. I mean, we're paid by the Washington Post, so we have no interest, we have no stake in the team. And obviously we root for the story like Barry said. And I think that's, maybe the main delineation that you'll see.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. My name is Chase Cohen. I'm a freshman here at the business school, and I'm also a member of our Sports Business Association. And as both of you stated before, you have background covering the NFL, Barry with the Redskins and Sam with the Chargers. And apart from how you would frame the importance of each game, because the NFL has a much shorter schedule, were there any other differences between how you would cover the two sports?
So I just start. I mean, I covering the NFL immediately after covering baseball to me was just the most stark contrast that there could be. And one thing that just from a playing standpoint and a preparation standpoint that stood out, you kind of know that the NFL is violent, and we know a lot about physically what it can do to players over time now. But I also, through covering the NFL, gained a greater appreciation for baseball players because, and I've said this a million times, and the idea behind this became a book that I wrote called The Grind. Baseball players every day are on a stage with 30,000 people in the stands and hundreds of thousands of people watching on TV. If they go 0 for 4 with 3 strikeouts, that is in the paper, that is in a box score, that is in history. If a middle linebacker for the Redskins has a lousy practice on Wednesday, no one knows about it. The NFL week is a crescendo to Sunday to a 3-hour, extremely intense performance window. Baseball has a 3-hour performance window 13 times in 14 days. So my appreciation for the preparation, the exposure to slumps, the exposure to failure, the nature of failure in baseball is being woven in and baked into how even successful careers went off the charts through seeing it from an NFL standpoint, where I didn't feel like the guys were under a microscope as often or as intensely.
I made sort of the opposite transition. I went from the NFL right to baseball. And the thing that surprised me most was that the sort of the grace that I think most baseball players and baseball managers exhibit under that pressure, because in football, everything is sort of treated like a state secret. I mean, it's not just the game plan. Is my star running back going to play on Sunday? I'm not going to tell you until Friday, until I have to tell you. In baseball, even when Davie Martinez is setting up his pitching rotation for the World Series, you ask him, he says, "Oh, I can't tell you." And then he says, like, basically a wink, wink, nudge, nudge. If you've been here all year long, you know that we're going Scherzers, Strasburg, Corbin. It's sort of things are much more on the table in baseball. It's we've got what we've got, you've got what we got, and that's how it's going to play out. In football, there's a much more secretive sort of stiff arm, if you will, between you and sort of the manager or the coach. And I think one of the things I gained an appreciation for in baseball this year was certainly that grace at standing up and saying, I went over 4 with 3 strikeouts, including 2 with runners on base. That's on me. I think that's sort of the daily demand for that is certainly a big divide between the two.
So before we end, we'd like some free advice from you regarding writing. So, you guys write virtually every day. Students in this business school are writing frequently, and the expectations are high. What advice do you have for young writers who are trying to communicate ideas clearly?
I think so. I mainly have 3, and I think I was sitting in a college classroom going to things like this 2 years ago, and I think 3 of the biggest points that I learned is, first is you have to find someone who's willing to invest and sort of give you feedback, because when you're when you're a young writer trying to figure out how to do it, you don't even know where to go. It's like you're in a dark room just like searching for something. So if you can find someone, and you don't have to necessarily talk to them, like reading. Like I remember in college, reading people in the Post or the Wall Street Journal or things of like just different papers, and you see how different stories are constructed. I think that's really important and helpful. 2, I think, I came into college thinking, I need to have a thesaurus. I need to show you how smart I am. I need to show you these are the words. I can do this. And I think you just do that for show. And I think a lot of, great writers, even though, we have at our paper, it's very basic. It's complex ideas explained very simply. And I think the third thing is something I talked about earlier, which is you just need to have something new. Whether that's a new way to think about something, whether that's something someone didn't see, you just need to tell someone something they didn't know. And I think the response, when my inbox fills up with emails from readers, or when my editor sends me a note that says, "Hey, I really like this story," it's something that no one else had. And it's really hard to find things like that, especially as the events get bigger. But if you are able to find something like that, one example would be Chelsea Janes, who we talked about earlier. She had a note about Garrett Cole on the Astros, and he was at UCLA and he left, and the Nationals had a pitcher who was going to be at UCLA and ended up not being. She just had the frame and the context to point that out, and that was something I didn't see anybody else point out, and that's new, and that pushes the ball forward, and I think that's really valuable.
I would just say two things: do it again, do it again. That's the most important thing. And then just from a journalism thing, and I don't know if this applies to business school writing, but the writing is never going to be any good if the reporting is not there. So if you've not done the work, you're playing air guitar. And it's just, smart readers are going to be able to see that you don't have the goods to back up what you're writing about.
This has been great.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.
I want to say thank you to Sam and to Barry and to Bailey. You did a great job as co-moderator. And just let the audience know that George Talks Business continues Thursday with a live webcast from New York City. The guest will be Charles Bendit, co-CEO of Taconic Investment Partners and member of the GW Board of Trustees. And that session is made possible with the generous support from Mitch Blazer and Eduardo Stern, Dean's Board of Advisors members and former GW parents. And it will be hosted at the New York Athletic Club with the assistance of GW parents Missy and Scott Schiller. So we hope to see you either in New York or via webcast. Thanks again.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Okay.